Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here at our Competitive Advantage talk presented by Kager, also known as the Craft Analytics Group. I'm Kelly Conlin. I'm an MBA student at MIT Sloan. It is my pleasure to introduce you today to Kate Jackson, sports science entrepreneur and biomechanics expert from the University of Texas at Austin. And she will be presenting today her panel on Built for the Ride, the physicality of the wildest 8 seconds in sports. At the end, we'll have some time for questions, so you can just raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you. All right, thanks, Kate.
Well, thank you. Hi, everyone. So my name is Kate Jackson. I am a biomechanist, and what that means is I study movement, motion, and everything that impacts that. So the conference theme of analytics and motion feels pretty on brand for me. I'm primarily interested in skill execution across multiple sports, but lately my interest has been in looking at athletes that live on the extreme, so more extreme sports like bull riding, because what that does is it brings to the forefront different metrics that might otherwise be overlooked or undervalued in other sports, but has a massive capacity to completely reshape how we analyze and elevate performance. So we're at Sloan, so I'd be remiss to not illustrate that example without using basketball. So I want you to keep this mystery player in mind as we go through. Exceptional three-point shooter, extremely consistent, but out of nowhere he hits a 3-week slump. No injury, no change in workload, everything else that we measure biomechanically off the court and on the court with his shooting didn't provide any actionable insights as to why that was happening. So we're left wondering what on earth caused this slump. All right, bull riding. I think this is the clip maybe half of you came to see. So bull riding 101. You get on the bull, if you dare. You strap a rope around the bull's chest. That rope is not fastened to the bull in any way. So if you let go of the rope, it just falls off the bull, and frankly, so do you. If you're lucky enough to hang on for 8 seconds, you are qualified for a score out of 100. 50 points for you, 50 points for the bull. The bull is scored on how aggressive they are, and you are scored with how well you kind of qualitatively appear to maintain control of your body on the bull. This last clip is an example of Jose Vitor Leme. He's arguably one of the best riders in the world right now. He almost makes it look kind of easy, which from a scoring perspective works against him at times because he kind of makes it look pretty smooth. And the judges think, well, maybe that bull wasn't as aggressive. Bull riding is not necessarily new. However, in the team context, it just emerged in 2022. But bull riding's been around for a while. And with this slide in particular, I'm going to talk about the analytics of existing data. So all this work is done by Charlie Campbell. Stand up right there. So if you have any questions about this slide in particular, he would love for you to bother him. So what he's done is he's pulled data from the last 15 to 20 years of ride outcomes. So ride outcomes consists of the rider-bull matchup, ranking the riders, ranking the bulls, and optimizing that matchup to see which riders are more likely to succeed on a particular bull. So he's created these metrics to define that, and it's helped him simulate the seasons, figure out who's going to be successful, generate revenue, because if you don't stay on the bull, your team does not get revenue. It helps with rider valuation, pretty self-explanatory, using for contract negotiations, recruiting good riders, stealing from other teams. And lastly, lineup optimization. This one's particularly interesting. So at every team event, your team is given a list of bulls, and it's up to you to assign your riders to those bulls. So understanding these metrics has helped to maximize the success in creating that bull-rider matchup. But this is just results-based. This leaves a huge opening for additional data, which is where I come in. We look at nothing about the bull movement and certainly nothing about the rider. So the big what in this category is just that, finding ways to assess the athlete. So we perform various biomechanical evaluations, primarily off the bull for safety reasons, because it's completely untapped in this sport. For 2 main reasons. One, the practicality of it. It's a bit difficult to slap a bunch of sensors on the rider when they're on this bull. And secondly, cultural. The sport's very old school. And even though it's now a team sport in the US, the receptivity to being poked, prodded, and measured is not really there. So it's a little bit of a hurdle that we're pushing through. But ultimately, why are we doing this? The same reason we do it in every other sport, the big 3. Talent identification, player development, and return to play or injury mitigation. It's especially important in this sport because, again, team dynamics, very new, and they're looking to grow this sport and expand and build more teams. And in order to do that, you need to find new athletes, develop them, and try to keep them alive. Now, this is inherently difficult in bull riding because the threshold to participate while injured is very different compared to other sports. Charlie can attest that these guys will get on a bull, fall off, break their ankle, and get on the very next bull. And they'll tell you, well, I don't need my ankle to ride. So keeping these guys healthy over the season is extremely challenging. Now the how, this is my favorite part. I get to come in and I get to figure out ways to identify the demands of the sport and try and find ways to quantify what these athletes go through. The second part to that is then building an athlete profile that's as sport specific as possible. So the more ways that I can quantify the demands of the sport and the more ways that I can create an athlete profile that's representative of that sport, I create more overlap to get key performance indicators that best predict rider success and elevate performance. All right, so the demand of the sport. What do these guys go through? It's not unlike a roller coaster, similar G-forces, except you don't know where the directions are coming from. We can look at, with a couple sensors on the rider, we can look at the magnitude of forces, the direction, cumulative, so basically what kind of forces and what direction are they being thrown in, how aggressively, and lastly, how well they're able to posturally maintain their composure. I've been able to create these kind of stability zone charts. So that center zone is where you want to be. That means that you're able to retain your stability regardless of the directional forces that you're dealing with. That second ring is a bit of the danger zone. It's where you start to lose control a little bit, and the better riders are able to recuperate their control, like that guy in the upper left. And then once you get into that outer ring, you're done. You're getting thrown 30 feet. So I'm able to build these bull rider stability zones. So this tells us, okay, in that center ring, where you want to be, the larger that ring is, the better the rider, because they're able to, again, handle more forces in more directions and maintain stability. But what this also will show us is different biases in their directionality of being thrown. So this rider, for example, we see a pretty strong left bias, that when he deals with forces pushing him to the left, he tends to fall a lot more and be a lot less successful. So we can look at that experience on the bull, we can match that with what we find in his athletic profile and try to build up and fill in the gaps to improve his performance and get rid of this left bias. So building that profile. Initially, it's pretty easy to look at the standard evaluations, so things that are more familiar in combines and other sports. Strength, power, speed. These seem pretty self-explanatory in terms of needing them for bull riding. And when we do look at those things, yeah, when we look at professional bull riders and amateur riders, there's clear separation. The stronger, more powerful guys tend to perform better because at the end of the day, you're riding a 2,000-pound animal. But when we took away the amateur data and just looked at the professionals to try to understand why some are so much better than others, all of a sudden just these metrics were no longer predictive of success. So we have to expand our search and look elsewhere. This is where I think the next generation of analytics is going to come into play in terms of biomechanical evaluation. Again, looking at extreme sports like bull riding, it brings to the forefront sensory motor metrics. So some of these might be familiar to you if you've ever come back from an ACL tear or if you've suffered a concussion. But in bull riding, when we can do these evaluations beyond the baseline and create more sport-specific situations, it starts to uncover ways in which it significantly impacts their riding quality. This rider, for example, if we look at vision, we can manipulate which way their eyes are moving and see how that impacts the quality of their body movement. Because in bull riding, your posture is, you're on the bull, you're either American style, with a straight spine, Brazilian style, kind of hunched over, your chin is tucked and your eyes are between the shoulder blades of the bull. That's your posture. But if that bull turns one way or another, your head might not move, but your eyes will move. So if we can measure how that manipulates your ability to control your body, we can see that you're going to falter when the bull makes certain movements. So for this rider, when that bull makes a hard turn to his right, he falls off the majority of the time. A second example is proprioception, which is a very basic measure of where your sense of where you are is in space, if that makes sense. And what we found is just looking at the top riders, the top 5 riders conveniently are parked right there at the very bottom in the middle, which means that if we manipulate their other senses, they don't really lose track of where they are in space, which is incredibly important, as you can imagine, riding a bull. So when we take into account those sensory motor metrics, combined with the more traditional metrics that we see, there's a significant difference when we look at the relative comparison when you look at bull riders versus athletes in other sports, like basketball. So when we compare them, you can see, yeah, that top bull rider versus an amateur rider, massive differences in those sensory motor metrics. But then when you slap on the average basketball player on top of that, you can see, yeah, those sensory motor metrics obviously matter a lot more in bull riding and less impactful in basketball, relatively speaking. But that doesn't mean that they don't matter. So we're going to come back to our mystery player. Incorporating these metrics into his profile, we see that his vestibular score was significantly lower. And all that tells me is that when that system is messed with, that inner ear balance, his performance and his movement quality suffers severely. So back when we couldn't figure out why he was having that 3-week slump, nothing could explain it biomechanically. After we see this profile, my first question is, well, did you deal with any kind of upper respiratory infection or problem during that slump? And yeah, he had a sinus infection during that 3-week slump. So sometimes the answer is antibiotics. But going back to that amateur rider, if we want to elevate their performance as efficiently as possible, yes, we want to get him more powerful to bring him up to the level of that pro rider, but that might not always be the most impactful path. So we want to focus more on elevating those somatosensory factors. So what might an intervention like that look like? It's a 3-step approach. We start with priming, very basic, low level. This is just where we have complete control, 0 intensity, and we try and move them through different movement challenges while we challenge or deplete the sensory inputs from different systems. When we feel that they're performing well in that category, we shift them to integrating. We start to bring in more sport-specific postures. So that bull riding posture, chin tucked, eyes between the bull that we talked about, we'll establish that posture and we'll start to challenge the systems that way. And then the last category is challenging, where we want to boost the intensity and boost the unpredictability as much as we can. Now, there are inherent considerations regarding safety in this category because you can't just throw them on a bull and say, close your left eye, or we're going to mess with your vestibular balance. So we try and mimic that as much as possible with either a mechanical bull or an uneven surface or a practice bull. Practice bull is still a real bull, but they're not nearly as aggressive as the competition bulls. But again, we have to be careful. It's still a live animal and unpredictability is still quite high. And of course, the option to incorporate these different sensory motor challenges within their strength and power program is also a great option, particularly when it comes to efficiency if you're trying to develop an athlete in a short amount of time. All right, so not to disappoint, to further illustrate some of these examples and bringing it back to basketball, some of my work with the University of Texas women's basketball team. If you follow basketball, I'm sure you've heard of them. They're doing pretty well this year. So we had an athlete who came in, and her in-ring data showed a very strong left bias. So that means that about 10-15% of the time, she tended to miss to the left. And when we took a snapshot of some of those shots, you can see, oh, well, yeah, when you miss to the left, your hand tracks further to the left. Problem solved, just let's work on hand follow-through position. But why is she only doing that 1 out of 10 shots or 1 out of 7 shots? So we zoom in and we see what do those left misses all have in common. Court location. She only missed left when she was on the right side of the court. Well, that's pretty interesting. What else could have changed when she's on the right side of the court? So for her, the relevant sensory motor metric that came out of her profile was vision. She's incredibly right eye dominant. So if we take away her right eye, she just relies on her left eye to do basic movements and basic kind of coordination patterns, her movement quality suffered quite a bit. So how does that relate to shooting? Well, what this revealed is that her sight line had changed from the left side of the court to the right side of the court. Now, if you're focused on the hoop and you're just focused on the front edge of the hoop, regardless of where you are, your sight line doesn't really change. So that told us that her focal point is not at the front of the rim. It's actually at the back of the rim, not relative to where she was, just the true back of the rim. So when she shifted to the right side of the court, the ball lift pattern that slightly covered her right eye now covered that focal point. So what she did to compensate was she tilted her head, narrowed her body, and there's this whole slew of biomechanical adjustments just to achieve the goal of getting her right eye on that focal point. And this is a great finding for us because instead of just trying to address the symptom of those biomechanical adjustments, we can attack the cause. Short term, we can say, all right, maybe we're not going to have you shoot on the right side of the court for now. Then we can start to develop your left eye. Or we could also manipulate your ball lift pattern. Or we could try and retrain your focal point on the rim. So ultimately, these evaluations, I think, have a really strong case to be normalized in our sport evaluations. These standard evaluations that we typically do, combine, sport-specific, et cetera, still miss critical elements because ultimately we don't move in isolation. We're constantly taking in sensory input from various parts of our bodies to analyze our environment and control our movement. So incorporating these evaluations is going to help us achieve the big three of talent identification, player development, and return to play. Thank you.
So just raise your hand if you have a question. I'll bring you the mic.
In the PBR, when they get to the finals, there's, I think, 12, and then they go in reverse order and get to pick their bull. Do they look at some of your type of data as they're picking which bull they want to ride as they go down?
They eventually will. So this is very preliminary stages. So we have a database of about 50 riders that we've accumulated over the past maybe year or two. So yes, we're actively working on models that are going to assist Charlie in his analytical efforts to optimize that matchup.
Okay, and do they get it real time? Because they bring the rider out, and then he picks a bull right there in the arena. Do they have that immediately, that data?
No, not now. And mostly the limitations are the actual arena itself. So if we have a sensor on there, we're limited by Bluetooth. So what we're actually looking into is putting a receiver on the cameras that swing around the arena so that we can get more real-time feedback for them.
Okay.
Thank you. This is really great. What kind of technologies and tools do you use? Is it simply just the pose data that you're able to track those different metrics, or are there other tools that you can use to get that vision score?
Sure. So with the sensory motor scores, it's either with eye tracking or honestly, most of it is just markerless or marker-based movement screens, but with the controlled variables of manipulating the sensory motor system. So as a basic example for eye gaze, sorry, I keep hitting this mic. We can shift their eye gaze and then have them do a basic movement pattern and see how much they deviate from a comfortable, normal, kind of forward-facing position. But in terms of on the bull, that's usually just a small IMU.
So why 8 seconds? Why not 7 or 10? And if you go shorter or longer, what happens to some of the metrics?
It's a great question. Charlie, I don't know, 8 seconds just because?
My understanding, it's a lot of a tradition thing. They did 8 seconds back in the day because that's about how long people would ride bulls. Now there's guys who can ride it longer. But once you get 8 seconds, then you get scored and you consider it written.
Another factor to consider is if you go much longer, the bull loses their luster a little bit. But they have found other ways to make it more difficult. I guess it's always been this way. The opposing hand, the free hand, can't touch anything. The bull, yourself, nothing. But yeah, I don't know.
Hey, I just want to know how general this model would work across different sports and across different athletes with different physical figures.
Sorry, did you repeat? I didn't catch that.
Yeah, I just want to know how general the data here would work across different sports and also across different athletes with different physical figures.
Oh, I love that. So there's a couple ways that you can kind of cross-compare. One is just a straight-up comparison. So the spider chart I showed was relative data, just to show how different the functionality is of a basketball player versus a bull rider. But depending on how you want to collect that data, as long as you're consistent, you could have any kind of cross-comparison. But I'm also a huge fan of keeping it within the sport. There are ways that you can elevate these sensory motor tests that make it extremely sport-specific. Because otherwise, if you keep it all very foundational, you might lose some of that applicability, and now it just becomes a more advanced concussion screen, if that makes sense.
Yeah, hi. I'm wondering, in terms of athlete preparedness, have you ever looked at Formula One training? Because the things that they're countering, like G-forces and reaction times, are so similar. Certainly body types are quite different, but it's an area where they've done, just as much research, and I'm wondering if that has ever been a path that you've looked at.
Not as directly, but definitely very aware of the testing they do, and that's been a huge inspiration, because that's another great example of athletes that live in this very extreme side of it. And so I would wonder if you put a Formula One racer on there, if that would change the entire spider chart and just dwarf everybody else in those senses.
I was just wondering, it seems like you're very excited about the basketball aspect. You're doing more data on that and evaluation, and also, how did you figure out that she was right eye dominant from your evaluation?
A couple ways. We do an eye dominance test. Well, 2 eye dominance tests. One, which is just a basic kind of triangle look through. The other one is we can cover one eye, and then you can see movement quality depletion. So one simple example is, let's say you close one eye, close it, open it, close it, and then when you're closing it, see if you can touch a dot in front of you. Do the same thing with the opposite eye. So usually someone who has a severe depletion in one eye are not as successful in touching that dot. So we knew that she had a significant depletion there.
Biomechanics has increasingly become a bigger topic of conversation, in equestrian fields. Do you expect to expand into that area? And also, you had mentioned being able to analyze the animals' movements. Animal welfare and animal sports has become a big topic of conversation as well. Do you intend to expand on that area of your concept? 2 questions, sorry.
Animal rights, I'm not going to touch that one. But in terms of measuring the animal, again, the farthest I'm willing to go comfort-wise is the same small thumb-sized sensor that we have on the rider. That's all right. I know you had a question before that.
Do you intend to expand into the equestrian world with this technology?
Oh, equestrian world.
Yeah.
I've done markered motion capture on equestrian before. It's
cool.
quite challenging.
Yeah.
You never know what the future holds, but I've primarily been interested in human locomotion and human performance as opposed to horse. But yeah, it's fascinating. They've been doing it for, I think, the last couple of decades.
Yeah, I just had a brief question. You mentioned the American way and the Brazilian way, like a change in technique. Can you just expand on how any of these metrics, or the interplay between the different techniques the riders have and some of these metrics, is one shown to be more successful, or a different profile with one technique?
Technically, I feel like the Brazilian is more successful, but there are other factors you have to consider at play, because down in Brazil, these guys are born and live on the back of a bull. So you can't always necessarily equate their technique to being superior. It could just be a consequence of their vast experience and things like that. But I'll be interested to see how that evolves, especially as we look at more joint-by-joint biomechanics, if we can get that type of information on the bull. So I imagine that answer will be forthcoming.
Hey there. I'm curious, if you were to retrain an athlete that was maybe making compensations for something because of vision or some other sensory, whatever, would you have concerns about impact to all the other areas of their performance if they were to correct something like that?
Of course, and that's why usually at the high level, timing is important. So I would never touch an athlete in the middle of season. You really don't want to manipulate those things. But it's a slow and steady pace with constant retesting in between. Because I think doing these sensory motor retraining is still relatively unexplored across other sports, particularly when you have other aspects you have to consider if it's going to impact their strength, power, movement quality, etc. So slow and easy, a lot of retesting is the short answer.
Thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, we are out of time for questions, but Kate is going to be outside, and if you want to ask her questions there afterwards, she's open to that as well. So thank you, everyone, for attending.